In tonight's episode, we're diving into three chilling stories from across Asia, each one more unsettling than the last. The first takes us deep into the countryside of Chiayi, Taiwan, where a crumbling mansion hides a curse that has terrified locals for nearly a century. From the outside, it looks like nothing more than an abandoned relic, its walls strangled by vines and its windows shattered by time. But inside, the silence is heavy, and the air feels colder than it should. Travelers who step too close whisper about strange cries in the night, sudden blasts of icy wind, and a woman in white silently standing near a forgotten well. What really happened in this house? Tonight, we'll uncover the legend of the Minxiong haunted house. The Minxiong haunted house does not sit in the center of any busy city. It hides in the countryside of Chiayi, where the trees press close and the air feels heavy with silence. Most people would drive past without knowing what waits down the narrow road, because from a distance the structure looks almost beautiful. A Baroque-style mansion built in 1929 by a wealthy businessman. Its arches and balconies once stood proudly in the Sunday. Today, those same walls are cracked and crawling with vines, the roof sagging under decades of rain and neglect. Windows gape like empty eyes, staring out at anyone bold enough to come closer. For our story, the main character is a young traveler who had heard the whispers from locals while staying in Chiayi. Ghost hunters and thrill seekers often share the name of this mansion like a forbidden secret, daring each other to go closer. But the traveler wasn't just looking for an abandoned ruin to photograph. They wanted to understand why everyone warned against the place, why families refused to live there, and why even the mention of its name made older villagers fall silent. Curiosity was the goal, but as is often the case with cursed places, curiosity came with a price. The traveler arrived in the late afternoon, when the sky was turning gold and shadows were beginning to stretch. The jungle around the mansion seemed to grow thicker the closer they came, until the building itself appeared almost swallowed by green. Stepping onto the cracked stone path, the air immediately shifted. The temperature dipped. The sound of birds and insects, so loud in the countryside, suddenly thinned into quiet. The traveler paused, uneasy, but pressed on. Inside, the atmosphere was worse. The grand entrance hall was coated in dust, but the structure of wealth was still visible. Ornate staircases, high ceilings, the echo of footsteps that felt too loud against the silence. Shards of broken glass crunched underfoot, and the smell of mold lingered. Yet beneath it all, there was something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, clinging to the back of the throat, like old blood. The traveler's reason for being here was simple enough: to capture the mansion's haunted beauty, maybe even confirm some of the legends for themselves. But standing in those dark halls, it felt less like they had discovered the house, and more like the house had been waiting for them. And in the stillness of the mansion's shadowed rooms, one question grew louder than all the other. Who, or what, was waiting inside? The first steps through the mansion were cautious, measured, like stepping into someone else's memory. The traveler had expected rot, dust, maybe the occasional rat scurrying across the floorboards, but what they didn't expect was how intact certain things still were. A wooden chair with one leg missing. A mirror with its glass cracked down the middle, yet still standing in the hallway as though waiting to reflect a face that never came. The air was thick, heavy with the dampness of the jungle, yet beneath it lay a strange, almost perfumed scent that didn't belong in an abandoned ruin. It clung faintly to the air, making the traveler hesitate. They raised their camera, hoping to capture the grand staircase framed by shafts of weak sunlight leaking through the roof. The first photo clicked, echoing louder than expected in the silence. But when they checked the screen, the image looked wrong. The staircase was there, the light was there, but shadows seemed thicker than they should be, stretching upward in a shape that didn't match the lines of the house. The traveler blinked, shook their head, took another shot. This time, The shadows looked normal. Maybe it was the failing light. Maybe it was their nerves. Still, the unease grew. They made their way deeper into the house, following a hallway where vines had crawled in through the shattered windows, curling across the floor like fingers reaching inward. That was when they noticed something strange. The vines didn't seem random. They clustered more heavily around a particular doorway, thick and twisted, as though nature itself was trying to keep something sealed away. The traveler paused, one hand hovering over the doorframe. The silence of the house pressed close around them, and for a brief second, they felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. A sudden sound broke it, faint, almost too faint to notice, but unmistakable. A splash of water. The traveler froze. It came again, distant but clear, echoing from deeper inside the mansion. Splashing water, like something moving in a well. The stories they had heard, whispered in the village, flickered in their mind, about the businessman's wife who had thrown herself into the well in despair, about her spirit cursed to remain. Slowly, hesitantly, the traveler stepped toward the sound. But before they could reach the source, another detail stopped them cold. On the floor of one of the smaller rooms, just barely visible in the dust, was the impression of footprints. Not the faded marks of long-gone residents, but fresh, sharp outlines pressed into the dirt as though someone had walked there minutes before. Bare feet, narrow and delicate, leading toward the same direction as the sound of water. The traveler's breath quickened. They were supposed to be alone in the house. The locals had warned them that no one lived here, that no one would dare. And yet, the footprints told a different story. Each step forward felt like trespassing into something intimate, something dangerous. The house no longer seemed empty, it seemed occupied. They followed the hallway until the sound grew louder, the steady rhythm of water dripping into water. The air was colder here, unnaturally cold, carrying a faint draft as if the walls themselves were breathing. The traveler turned a corner and finally saw it. An old stone well, sunken into the floor of a crumbling courtyard. The vines wrapped thickest here, curling along the edges of the stone like a cage. The water inside was dark, almost black, its surface rippling despite the stillness of the air. For a moment everything was still. Then came the third sound, soft but piercing, the sound of a woman crying, faint, distant, yet unmistakable, drifting upward from the black water of the well. The traveler froze, their skin crawling with dread. The first complication had arrived, and it was no longer a question of whether the legends were true. It was a question of how close they dared get to the truth. The traveler stood rooted at the edge of the courtyard, eyes fixed on the well. The sound of crying had already faded, replaced by silence so sharp it rang in their ears. For a moment, they thought they had imagined it. But then, something shifted. A cold wind rushed through the courtyard, though the air outside was still. It carried with it the smell of damp earth and something sour, like rotting flowers. The traveler stepped back instinctively, heart pounding. They wanted to leave. Every instinct told them to turn around, but the mansion seemed unwilling to let go. As they turned toward the hallway, something caught their eye. Along the cracked stone wall, scratched into the surface, were words in Chinese characters. The markings were faint, as if etched in desperation with something sharp. The traveler knelt closer, brushing away moss. The message read, "Do not look into her eyes." Before they could process the meaning, the air shifted again. From the far end of the courtyard, a figure seemed to move. Just for a moment, a blur of white fabric vanishing behind a doorway. The traveler froze. Someone was here. They weren't alone. Compelled, they stepped toward the doorway, every nerve in their body screaming at them to stop. The hallway beyond was darker than before, the air colder. They raised their flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows, and that's when they saw it. Another set of footprints in the dust. This time, they were larger. Not bare feet like before, but shoes. Heavy, deliberate. Someone else had been inside recently, maybe still was. The conflicting thought struck them. Was it possible another explorer, another thrill-seeker, was in the house? The idea should have been comforting, but instead it made the traveler's chest tighten. Whoever it was had not announced themselves, and that silence felt dangerous. The traveler pressed forward, their own footsteps echoing too loudly. As they turned the corner, the beam of their flashlight swept across something chilling, a doorframe streaked with dark stains. Rust, maybe, or blood. Beside it, another warning scratched into the wood. This one was clearer, fresher. Don't let her follow you home. The words rattled through their mind, sharper than the cold. Why would anyone carve such a thing unless they had seen something they couldn't explain? And if they had left, had they survived long enough to escape the curse? From somewhere above came a sound, footsteps creaking across the upper floor. Slow, steady, measured. The traveler's pulse spiked. They weren't sure which was worse. The thought of another person hiding in the shadows, or the possibility that it wasn't human at all. The mansion no longer felt like a ruin. It felt alive, watching, waiting. And as the footsteps faded, replaced again by the echo of distant crying, the traveler realized the legends had only scratched the surface of what lurked here. Something wanted to be noticed. Something wanted them to stay. The traveler's breath came shallow as they stood in the dark hallway, torn between retreat and the pull of something unseen. The etched warnings scratched into the walls, replayed in their mind like a drumbeat. Do not look into her eyes. Don't let her follow you home. Who had written them? Survivors? Or victims, carving their last desperate messages into the house before vanishing forever? Above, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't slow. They were urgent, moving quickly across the second floor, then stopping abruptly, as though whoever, or whatever it was, had realized it was being followed. The traveler's flashlight shook in their hands as they aimed it toward the grand staircase, half expecting someone to appear at the landing. For a moment, nothing, only silence. Then came the sound again, crying. Louder now, closer. The traveler's legs carried them forward against reason. At the top of the staircase, the corridor stretched into darkness, doors hanging off broken hinges, wallpaper peeling like dead skin. The crying echoed from one of the far rooms. Each step closer seemed to pull at the air itself, until even the sound of their own breathing felt muted. They reached the doorway, its frame warped and leaning, and pushed inside. The beam of the flashlight swept across the room, collapsed furniture, a broken vanity mirror, vines crawling down from the ceiling. But it froze when it caught movement in the corner. There she was, a figure dressed in white, long hair hanging like a curtain over her face, shoulders trembling with soft sobs. The traveler's chest tightened. Every instinct told them to run, yet their legs refused to move. They remembered the warning on the wall, do not look into her eyes. But the figure lifted her head. Through the strands of hair, a pale face emerged, hollow cheeks, lips parted as though whispering something too faint to hear. Her eyes were hidden. For a moment, the traveler felt relief, until the head tilted further back and two dark sockets stared directly at them. Not eyes, but empty voids, black and endless, pulling at the edges of the room like gravity. The crying stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, without warning, the mirror on the vanity shattered with a sharp crack, glass exploding outward as though struck from inside. Shards rained across the floor, and in every piece of broken glass, the traveler saw her face reflected, not just once, but dozens of times, each reflection showing her staring back, eyes no longer hollow but alive, wide, and fixed on them. The traveler stumbled backward, heart racing, the flashlight beam swinging wildly across the walls. Every surface seemed to shimmer with faint movement, shadows stretching where they shouldn't, whispers rising from the cracks. The house itself was no longer just haunted. It was awake. And in that moment of terror, the traveler understood. This wasn't about a woman bound to a well. This was about a curse woven into the mansion itself, a spirit that had rooted into the walls, the floors, the mirrors, the very air. Escaping, it would not be as simple as walking out the front door, because now the house knew they were here, and it wasn't about to let them go. The traveler stumbled down the staircase, glass crunching beneath their shoes, the echo of whispers still clinging to their ears. The mansion seemed to shift with each step, as though it were breathing, walls contracting and expanding in rhythm with their panic. They didn't stop moving until they reached the courtyard again, the old stone well waiting in the center, like a mouth that had swallowed too many secrets. The air here was colder than anywhere else in the house. The vines wrapped tight around the stone looked less like plants and more like restraints. For a moment, the traveler thought about the crying woman they had just seen, or thought they had seen, and realized it had all led back here. The footprints in the dust, the strange scent, the warnings on the walls, every clue circled the well. Kneeling closer, they dared to peer into the darkness. The water at the bottom rippled faintly, though no stone had been thrown. And then, just as their breath steadied, a voice rose from below. Not crying this time, but a whisper. The words were muffled, carried up through the cold air. Straining to hear, the traveler caught fragments. Pleas for help, a name repeated, and finally the word curse. It clicked. The legend of the businessman's wife was not just a ghost story told by villagers. She had truly thrown herself into this well, and her despair had rooted itself into the house. The house was not haunted by visitors or passers-by. It was haunted by her, bound to the water that had claimed her. The strange perfume in the air, the scratches on the wall, the figure in white, all pieces of the same tragedy, repeating endlessly. But another realization followed, more terrifying than the first. If she was bound here, then why the warnings carved into the walls? Why the desperate message, "Don't let her follow you home"? The traveler's heart pounded as they pieced it together. Perhaps she was not bound here at all. Perhaps the well was only the beginning. Anyone who came too close, anyone who looked too long, risked carrying her with them. The vines shuddered suddenly, as though something deep below had stirred. The traveler jerked back, stumbling onto the cracked stones of the courtyard. Their camera strap tugged at their neck, and for the first time, they felt the weight of it, not as a tool for proof, but as a danger. What if capturing her in a photo meant taking her presence with them? The revelation left them shaken. The woman in white was real. Her sorrow had cursed the house, and the curse did not stay behind once you walked away. It followed. The traveler didn't wait to see what else would rise from the well. They bolted through the hallway, every shadow stretching longer, every corner threatening to move. The grand doors of the mansion groaned as they shoved them open, spilling into the choking humidity of the jungle night. For a heartbeat, relief washed over them. The house was behind them. They were free. But freedom didn't feel right. The silence of the countryside was too heavy, the darkness too still. They walked faster down the overgrown path, refusing to look back. Yet with each step, they swore they heard another set of footsteps following, just out of sync with their own. Slow, bare. Back at their small guest house in Chiayi, the traveler tried to convince themselves it had been nerves, dust, shadows, a brain too eager to believe ghost stories. They washed their face, stared at their reflection in the bathroom mirror, and felt their pulse calm. Until they noticed it. Behind their reflection, faint but undeniable, was another figure. A woman in white, head bowed, hair draped across her face. She stood just far enough back that her features blurred, but close enough that the traveler felt the weight of her presence. They spun around. The room was empty. The mirror, however, told a different story. The woman in white had not stayed behind in the mansion. She had come with them. And just like the words carved into the wall had warned, she was never going to let them go. The story of the Minxiong haunted house is only the beginning. Across Asia, shadows cling to buildings that were never meant to hold peace, and the deeper you look, the darker the history becomes. Our next tale takes us from the quiet countryside of Taiwan to the bustling city of Semarang, Indonesia. There stands a structure so vast and so unsettling. Locals call it Lawang Sewu, the Thousand Doors. At first glance, it is a colonial masterpiece, its endless halls and towering windows still commanding respect. But beneath its beauty lies something much darker: torture, death, and restless spirits. And among the corridors, whispers of the headless dead still walk. This is not just another haunted building, this is Lawang Sewu. Lawang Sewu sits in the heart of Semarang, a sprawling colonial relic that has loomed over the city for more than a century. Its name, Thousand Doors, is not just poetic exaggeration. The building's countless doors and windows stretch endlessly across its labyrinthine halls, creating the eerie impression that you are always being led somewhere else, though not always somewhere you want to go. By day, it attracts curious tourists and history buffs. By night, it is something else entirely, a place locals warn should never be entered alone. Our story follows a young architecture student visiting Semarang for research. Fascinated by Dutch colonial buildings, they came not only to admire Lawang Sewu's grand design, but also to document how it had survived through war, occupation, and decades of neglect. Their goal was academic: photographs, notes, and sketches for a university project. Yet, even as they approached the towering structure in the late afternoon, there was a weight to the air that felt wrong. The student noticed how the locals avoided the building as the sun began to dip lower. Motorcyclists sped up near its gates, pedestrians crossed the street to keep their distance. One old man sitting by a food stall watched the student with a sharp look and muttered a warning under his breath, something about the basement, something about not staying after dark. The student smiled politely, brushing it off as superstition, but the words clung to the back of their mind. Inside, Lawang Sewu was a maze. The students' footsteps echoed against the high ceilings as they passed through endless doors and corridors. Light filtered in through tall windows, but instead of illuminating the place, it fractured into strange patterns, leaving entire stretches of hallway in shadow. Dust floated lazily in the beams of sunlight, and every gust of wind through the broken panes rattled doors just enough to sound like whispers. They began their work methodically, snapping photographs of the arches, tracing the curves of the staircases in their notebook. But the further they went, the heavier the atmosphere became. The air grew colder near the lower levels, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rust. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed shut on its own. The student flinched but reminded themselves the building was old, its wood swollen and temperamental. Still, curiosity tugged them downward. They had heard the stories. The basement once used as a prison and torture chamber during the Japanese occupation. Many visitors refused to step foot there. But for the student, it was the heart of the building, the place where history bled most clearly through the walls. With notebook in hand and a shaky breath, they descended toward the basement, unaware of what truly waited for them in the shadows of Lawang Sewu. The staircase into the basement was narrow and steep, the kind of descent that made each step feel like a point of no return. The architecture student gripped the railing, its iron cold and slick with condensation. The deeper they went, the dimmer the light became, until only the weak glow of their phone flashlight cut through the gloom. Down here, the air was different, thicker, damp, and laced with a metallic tang that immediately made them think of rust or blood. At the bottom, the corridor stretched in both directions. The walls were lined with heavy doors, most rusted shut, their hinges fused from decades of neglect. The student paused, uneasy, before raising their phone to snap a picture. The flash illuminated the hallway for only a second, but that was enough to reveal something they hadn't noticed. Water. A thin trail of it ran along the edge of the corridor, snaking its way toward the darkness. Curiosity pulled them forward. They followed the water until it widened into a shallow pool seeping up from the cracks in the stone floor. It wasn't clear. It was dark, cloudy, as if something had stained it long ago. The student crouched to inspect it, and that's when they heard it, the faint sound of metal dragging across stone. They froze. The sound came again, sharper this time, like chains being pulled somewhere deeper in the basement. Their mind raced. It had to be part of the restoration, maybe leftover construction equipment, or even a security guard. But the rhythm of it was too deliberate. Drag, pause, drag, pause. The sound of someone moving slowly in the dark. They stood quickly, their heart pounding, and called out a hesitant hello. The word echoed back to them, bouncing off the stone walls until it seemed like the basement itself was whispering. No reply came. Only the chain continued to scrape forward, closer now, though still unseen. The student backed toward the staircase, but as they turned, something caught their eye. One of the doors along the corridor stood slightly ajar, though moments ago it had appeared closed. Through the narrow gap, the beam of their flashlight revealed scratch marks carved deep into the wood. Long, desperate gouges, like fingernails, dragged downward over and over again. Their throat tightened. These weren't the marks of time or rot. They were the marks of someone trying to claw their way out. As they stepped back, the chain sound abruptly stopped. The silence was worse. They held their breath, straining to hear anything, but the basement offered nothing. Just as their shoulders eased, convinced it was their imagination, another sound broke the stillness, a drip of water, slow and steady, directly behind them. They spun around. The pool they had seen earlier was rippling, disturbed by something beneath its surface. And in the faint light, for just an instant, it looked like a hand reached up through the water before vanishing again. The students staggered back, pulse racing. They told themselves it was impossible. It had to be a trick of light, a reflection. But deep down, something colder settled in their chest. They weren't alone down here. The first complication had revealed itself. Lawang Sewu wasn't just a place where bad things once happened. It was a place where those things had never really stopped. The student's breath quickened as the rippling water stilled, leaving behind only silence and the faint smell of rust clinging to the air. Every nerve in their body screamed at them to leave, but something stronger, curiosity, or perhaps the strange gravity of the place, kept their feet rooted to the basement floor. Their phone light wavered across the stone corridor, bouncing from one rusted door to another, until it landed on the one slightly ajar. The scratches in the wood seemed deeper now, almost wet, as though freshly carved. Before they could think better of it, the student pushed the door open. Hinges groaned like a wounded animal, and the beam of light revealed a cramped, suffocating cell. The walls were stained with dark patches that no restoration work had ever fully erased. Shackles hung from the corners, their chains rusted but still heavy, still capable of holding weight. The floor was damp, covered with shallow puddles that reflected the light in broken shards. Then came the sound again. Not chains this time, but footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, echoing down the corridor from somewhere unseen. The students snapped their head toward the noise, phone trembling in their grip. "Hello?" Their voice cracked, small against the weight of the silence. No answer, only the footsteps, closer now. They stepped back into the corridor, heart hammering, eyes scanning desperately, and that was when they saw it. At the far end of the hallway, half shrouded in shadow, stood a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like the tattered remains of a soldier's uniform. But where the head should have been, there was nothing, just a jagged void, neck ending in air. In one hand, the figure carried an old lantern, its glow faint but unnatural, flickering without flame. The students' knees locked. The stories they had heard from locals, the headless Dutch soldier wandering the halls, were suddenly, horrifyingly real. The figure began to move. Each step was accompanied by the low clink of chains dragging across the stones. The lantern swayed, casting warped shadows across the walls, making the doors look as though they were breathing. The students stumbled backward, clutching their bag, but every direction seemed wrong. Behind them, the welling pool of water. Ahead, the headless figure, relentless. Panic surged, and the student darted into another side passage, lungs burning. The corridor twisted endlessly, one door after another, none offering safety. Every glance over their shoulder showed the same thing, the faint glow of the lantern, steady, always following. Finally, the student collapsed against a wall, chest heaving. They raised their light, and their stomach dropped. Etched into the plaster, barely visible beneath layers of grime, were words in Dutch and Indonesian, different hands, different times, all saying the same thing: he never stops walking. The realization hit like ice. The soldier wasn't just a ghost lingering where he had died. He was bound to the building, endlessly patrolling, endlessly searching. And anyone who wandered too deep into the 1,000 doors risked becoming part of his watch. The student's perspective shifted in that moment. This wasn't about history anymore. It wasn't about architecture. Lawang Sewu wasn't a monument of the past. It was a prison, and something inside had just marked them as its next captive. The student pressed their back against the wall, every muscle rigid, the words carved into the plaster searing into their mind. He never stops walking. Suddenly, the endless corridors and countless doors of Lawang Sewu no longer seemed like architectural wonders. They were traps, designed not to impress but to confuse, to keep both the living and the dead wandering forever. The lantern's glow still flickered faintly down the hall, drawing nearer with each step. Desperate, the student turned and stumbled into another chamber, slamming the door behind them. The darkness inside was suffocating, the air damp and cold, but at least the light was gone. They switched on their phone's flashlight again and swept it across the walls. What they saw reframed everything they thought they knew. The room wasn't empty. Its walls were covered in writing, scratches, carvings, stains, all layered atop one another in a chaotic collage of fear. Some were in Dutch, some in Japanese, others in Bahasa Indonesia, spanning decades. Each message told fragments of the same story: prisoners begging for release, warnings about drowning, desperate notes to families that would never read them. And then, scattered among the cries, were chillingly consistent phrases. Chains in the dark. The soldier with no head. She waits by the windows. The student's pulse raced as their light swept across one final etching, fresher than the rest, words gouged deep into the stone as though written in panic. Do not answer when they call your name. It all made sense now. The screams visitors had heard, the dragging chains, the female figure pacing by the windows. They weren't random hauntings. They were echoes of what the building had absorbed. The prison, the torture, the executions, all of it had bled into the walls. Lawang Sewu wasn't haunted by a single ghost. It was haunted by memory itself, replaying horrors endlessly, pulling anyone who entered deeper into its cycle. The realization shifted everything. The soldier wasn't pursuing them personally, he was fulfilling his eternal patrol. The cries from the water, the hand reaching through, were prisoners reliving their drowning. The woman by the windows was not waiting for escape, but doomed to pace forever. The architecture student understood the truth, but it offered no comfort, because in recognizing the pattern, they also recognized their place in it. They were no longer just a visitor. They were part of the story now, and if they stayed any longer, the building would decide what role they would play. The student didn't wait to see if the headless soldier's lantern would appear outside the door. They shoved it open and bolted down the corridor, their footsteps slapping against the stone in uneven rhythm. Every door they passed looked the same, every turn identical, as though the building itself were reshaping to keep them inside. Panic clawed at their chest until finally, they saw a faint shaft of daylight spilling through a cracked doorway. Bursting outside, they gasped for air. The noise of the city, traffic, voices, motorbikes rushed back all at once, almost deafening compared to the silence within. For a moment, relief surged through them. They had escaped. But something felt wrong. As they hurried down the street, clutching their bag, they caught sight of their reflection in a shop window. At first, it was just themselves, sweat-soaked, wide-eyed. Then the reflection flickered. Behind their shoulder, faint and distorted, was another shape. A tall figure, broad-shouldered, holding a lantern that glowed faintly even in the Sunday. The student spun around. The street was empty. Their pulse pounded as they backed away, eyes fixed on the glass. The figure in the reflection hadn't vanished. It was still there, walking, following. And that was when the student remembered the final words carved into the prison wall. Do not answer when they call your name. Because if the soldier had already followed them out of Lawang Sewu, how long before he spoke? From the cursed mansion in Taiwan to the endless corridors of Indonesia, we've seen how some places refuse to let go of their past. But our journey doesn't end there. For the final story of the night, we travel westward into the deserts of Rajasthan, India, where ruins rise like broken teeth against the horizon. This is Bhangarh Fort, a place so feared that even the government warns against entering after dark. Legends claim a sorcerer's curse doomed the city to eternal ruin, and locals swear the shadows inside still belong to those who never escaped. Two backpackers once wandered through its gates, ignoring every warning. What they found was not a forgotten fort, but a city that still breathes, quietly, darkly, and with eyes fixed on anyone who dares to enter. Bhangarh Fort rises from the edge of the Aravalli Hills like the bones of a long-dead giant, its massive gates looming over the desert landscape. Once a thriving city of temples, palaces, and markets, it is now nothing more than a skeleton of its former glory. The ruins are beautiful in their decay, arched gateways leaning against time, stone walls fractured by centuries of heat and storms. Yet for all its grandeur, the place carries a silence that is heavier than the desert air, a silence that makes even the wind sound like a whisper. Our story follows two backpackers, travelers exploring Rajasthan on their way between Jaipur and Alwar. They had heard the warnings whispered in tea stalls and bus stations. Never enter Bhangarh after sunset, never carry anything from its grounds, and never answer if you hear your name called inside the walls. The locals spoke these words with such weight that even the government had posted signs forbidding visitors after dark. But the backpackers were curious, and curiosity is often stronger than fear. They arrived in the late afternoon, sunlight turning the desert sand a dull gold. From a distance, the fort looked almost inviting, framed by rolling hills and fields dotted with scrub trees. But the closer they came, the more they felt it, the strange heaviness in the air, the unnatural stillness. Where there should have been birds, there was silence. Where there should have been laughter from tourists, there was only the echo of their own footsteps. Inside the gates, the ruins stretched out like a labyrinth. Empty temples leaned toward the earth, their idols long removed. Broken palaces cast long shadows across cracked courtyards. The two backpackers wandered slowly, cameras slung around their necks, marveling at the architecture. One joked that the place felt like an abandoned stage set, waiting for actors to appear. The other laughed, though the sound was nervous, bouncing too loudly off the stone walls. Their goal was simple enough: to explore, to take photographs, to say they had been inside India's most haunted fort, but with every step, the mood shifted. The air grew heavier, cooler, as though the desert sun had suddenly been stripped of its heat. A strange unease began to settle over them, subtle at first, but impossible to shake. By the time they reached the heart of the ruins, standing before a temple long forgotten by time, they could no longer convince themselves it was only imagination. Something was waiting here, watching, hidden in the silence of Bhangarh's broken city. The two backpackers lingered at the temple courtyard, the sun sinking lower behind the Aravalli hills. The long shadows spilling across the broken stone seemed alive, shifting faster than the fading light should allow. They laughed nervously, brushing it off, and turned their attention to the carvings along the temple walls. The sandstone figures were worn smooth by centuries, their faces eroded until only hollow sockets stared back. One of the travelers raised a camera and snapped a photo. The shutter clicked, echoing strangely in the open air. But when they looked at the screen, their stomach tightened. The frame showed not just the ruined temple, but a blurred shape standing between the pillars. It looked vaguely human, tall, dark, with its head bowed, but neither of them had seen anyone there when the picture was taken. Probably a glitch, the other whispered, but their voice lacked confidence. They both checked the courtyard, empty. Nothing but the sound of the wind stirring dust at their feet. Trying to shake the unease, they pressed deeper into the fort. Passing through arched gateways, they entered another courtyard, smaller and more enclosed. Here, the silence was worse. No breeze moved, no sound at all, as if the world had been muted. One of them dropped a stone just to break the stillness, but instead of clattering against the ground, the sound seemed to fade before it fully reached their ears. The other gave a half smile, though their eyes betrayed something else, fear. It was then they heard it, a whisper. Faint, barely a breath, but unmistakable. A voice calling one of their names. The first traveler froze, skin crawling, turning in circles to find the source. "Did you hear that?" they asked. The second nodded, pale, clutching their camera tighter. They waited, but no one appeared. The corridors were empty, the courtyards deserted, and yet the voice came again, this time clearer. The same name, spoken slowly, almost tenderly, as though coaxing them closer. Both stood motionless, staring at each other. The warnings they had laughed at earlier came rushing back. Never answer when you hear your name inside Bhangarh. But the voice was insistent, soft as silk, winding through the silence like smoke. Determined to prove it was only imagination, one of them stepped forward toward a nearby archway, raising the flashlight on their phone. The beam illuminated the stone walls, the cracks, the weeds pushing through the ground. Nothing unusual, but when the light swept across the far corner, something moved. A shadow peeled itself from the wall, stretching unnaturally, before melting back into the stone. The traveler stumbled back, muttering that it must have been the angle, the light playing tricks. Yet deep down, both knew it wasn't. Shadows didn't move on their own. The sun was almost gone now, and the fort's walls glowed faintly red with the last light of day. As darkness crept in, the two backpackers felt the shift completely. The ruins no longer seemed abandoned. They felt inhabited, filled with unseen eyes and unheard footsteps. The first complication was undeniable. Something inside Bhangarh had noticed them, and it wasn't planning to stay silent for long. The two backpackers hurried through the narrowing corridors, hoping the growing darkness was only making their imaginations run wild. But the silence of the fort pressed closer with every step, and they couldn't ignore the sensation that the ruins had awakened with the setting Sunday. They entered another courtyard, this one larger, lined with half-collapsed structures. In the center stood the remains of a shrine, its pillars cracked but still upright. One of them approached, shining their light across the base. There, etched faintly into the stone, was writing, old Sanskrit letters, partially worn away. They couldn't read it, but something about the lines carved deep into the rock felt desperate, like a warning left behind. As they leaned closer, a gust of cold air whipped through the courtyard, carrying with it a faint smell of ashes. Both froze. The desert nights were cool, but this was different. Icy, biting, wrong. And then came the second event. From one of the broken structures, they heard the sound of bangles clinking together, the delicate jingle of jewelry in motion. The travelers turned sharply, flashlights cutting across the rubble. For a split second, the beam caught something. A woman's silhouette, draped in what looked like traditional Rajasthani dress, standing by the doorway. Her head was lowered, her hands at her sides. But before either of them could speak, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but empty stone. The second traveler whispered what both were already thinking. The stories of the princess. The legend of the sorcerer who cursed Bhangarh after she rejected him, dooming the city and all who lived within. If that woman had been her, then perhaps the curse was not just legend, but still alive, replaying itself within these ruins. Suddenly, the silence was broken by another voice. This time, it wasn't soft or coaxing. It was sharp, male, and furious, echoing from the temple walls. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger. The two froze, scanning the dark, unable to find the source. One of them gripped the other's arm, whispering they had to leave. But as they turned back toward the gate, they noticed something chilling. Carved into the wall of the shrine, just above the old Sanskrit, were fresher marks. English words scratched crudely into the stone. Do not leave with her. Neither knew what it meant, whether it referred to the shadowed princess or something else entirely. But the implication gnawed at them. The fort was no longer just ruins. It was a battleground between memories, the princess, the sorcerer, the countless lives destroyed by the curse. And now, the two backpackers had stepped into the middle of it. The question wasn't whether something would happen. The question was, which side of the curse would claim them first? The desert sky had darkened to deep violet, and within the walls of Bhangarh, night seemed to fall twice as fast. The backpackers moved quickly now, their flashlights jittering across broken walls and hollow temples, but every direction looked the same. Gates that had seemed clear earlier now led only to more ruins, more twisting paths. The fort was shifting around them, closing them in. The clinking of bangles returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty streets. They stopped cold, and in that pause, the sound changed. It became footsteps. Not one set, but many, pressing down into the sand with steady rhythm. Yet when they turned their lights on the ground, the earth was bare, no footprints, no movement, only the sound of a crowd pressing closer. One of them called out shakily, demanding to know who was there. The only answer was a whisper, female, brushing past their ears like a breeze. Leave before it's too late. Both spun, lights flashing wildly, but no one was behind them. Only the ruined shrine and the darkening arches. The second backpacker grabbed the first and hissed that they needed to get out, but the path toward the gate seemed impossibly far now. Every corridor turned them back toward the heart of the fort. And then, at the edge of their lights, the silhouette appeared again, the woman in Rajasthani dress. She was closer now, standing directly in the middle of the path, her head tilted downward, her hands limp at her sides. This time she didn't vanish. She began to move. Slowly, deliberately, her anklets jingled with each step, the sound sharp against the silence. The backpackers backed away, hearts racing, until they felt the cold stone of a temple wall press against their shoulders. That was when the second voice cut through, A man's voice, booming, filled with rage, echoing across the ruins. "You are mine." The words reverberated through the walls as if the fort itself had spoken them. The woman's figure stopped, frozen mid-step, as though held back by the voice. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as the two travelers stood trapped between something they couldn't understand. The legends crashed together in their minds: the sorcerer who cursed the princess, the doomed city, the endless whispers of those who never left. The woman was no mere shadow. She was the princess herself, still bound to the ruins, her sorrow echoing through time. And the voice, the sorcerer's fury, still stalked the walls, claiming what he had destroyed centuries ago. The ground trembled faintly beneath their feet, dust falling from the arches above. The lantern light of their phones flickered, as though strained by the weight of the curse itself. For the first time, the backpackers realized they weren't simply witnessing a haunting. They were intruders in a story still playing out, a tragedy with no end. And the fort wasn't just showing it to them, it was pulling them in. The two backpackers clung to the wall, eyes darting between the shadowy princess and the echoing voice that still thundered through the ruins. The tension in the air was unbearable, as if the fort itself were holding its breath. Then, in an instant, the woman's figure vanished, like smoke scattered by the wind. The footsteps stopped. The voice went silent. The silence that followed was worse than the chaos. Slowly, the travelers lowered their flashlights, their beams sweeping across the stones until one of them froze. Carved into the wall beside them, faint but visible, were words in Hindi. The letters were old, shallow, but legible. They leaned closer, brushing away dust. Translated, the warning read, "She walks with sorrow, but he binds with rage. Neither can leave, and neither will let you go." The meaning sank in like ice. The princess, the figure they had seen pacing the ruins, was not simply a restless spirit. She was trapped here, cursed to repeat her grief for eternity. And the sorcerer's voice, they realized now, wasn't just legend either. His curse had chained him here as well, his fury etched into every stone, his presence controlling the fort long after death. It explained the conflicting sensations, the sorrowful whispers calling them gently, the furious roars that rattled the walls. It explained the strange shifting paths, the endless corridors that never seemed to lead back to the gates. They weren't lost, they were being kept. The fresher inscription they had seen earlier, "Do not leave with her," took on new meaning. It wasn't a warning against the princess herself, but against what the sorcerer might do if he believed she was escaping. His rage wasn't only about her rejection, it was about ownership. Even in death, he would not allow her to leave, and anyone caught in between became part of their struggle. The backpackers exchanged a terrified glance. Their exploration had never been harmless sightseeing. They had walked into a prison of souls, a place where love had twisted into a curse powerful enough to doom an entire city. The revelation didn't offer relief. It only sharpened the dread. Because if the princess and the sorcerer were locked here forever, what would happen to two outsiders who had wandered into their eternal battle? The fort was no longer just a ruin. It was a stage. And now, they were unwilling actors in a story that refused to end. The two backpackers didn't wait for the next whisper or the next crash of the sorcerer's voice. They bolted, flashlights shaking wildly as they stumbled through the ruins, no longer caring which path was correct, only desperate to find the gates. The fort seemed endless, doors and arches repeating, courtyards blurring together in their frantic flight. Behind them, the sound of anklets jingled faintly, steady, keeping pace no matter how fast they ran. At last, through a jagged archway, they saw it, the outline of the main gate against the star-strewn desert sky. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. They pushed through the gates and collapsed on the dusty ground outside, gasping for breath, as the night air pressed cool against their skin. For a moment, relief washed over them. They were outside. They had escaped. But then one of them raised their camera, intending to delete the strange photographs they had taken. Their thumb froze on the screen. The last image, taken as they ran, showed the gate looming behind them. And in the shadows of the archway, a figure in Rajasthani dress stood motionless, her face hidden by the dark. The second traveler leaned over to look. Together, they watched as the image flickered strangely, as though the figure were moving inside the photo. Slowly, her head began to lift. They dropped the camera, but the sound of anklets still followed them into the night, whispering a question neither wanted answered. Had they left Bhangarh Fort, or had it left with them? I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you like them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.